The morning sun broke through the scattered clouds over the Solomon Islands on August 17, 1943, casting long shadows across the deck of the USS Essex. Lieutenant Commander James Hartford stood at the edge of the flight deck, his hand resting on the worn leather of his flight jacket. Behind him, his F4U Corsair gleamed in the early light, its distinctive inverted gull wings catching the reflection of the ocean below. The air smelled of salt, aviation fuel, and the faint trace of oil that always seemed to cling to the carrier deck. Hartford had flown 43 combat missions, but something about this morning felt different. The intelligence briefing had been tense, the reconnaissance photos showing unusual Japanese air activity near Bougainville. As he walked toward his aircraft, his boots echoing on the metal deck, he couldn't shake the feeling that today would test everything he had learned in the skies over the Pacific. If you're enjoying this story of courage and determination, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more incredible true stories from history. Hartford climbed into the cockpit of his Corsair, the familiar routine calming his nerves. The leather seat had molded to his body over months of flights, every crease and worn patch a testament to the hours he had spent in this aircraft. His hands moved automatically across the instrument panel, checking gauges and switches with the practiced efficiency of a concert pianist. Each dial told a story, each switch represented a system that could mean the difference between life and death. His crew chief, Petty Officer Second Class Michael Torres from San Diego, gave him a thumbs up from below. Torres had kept this bird flying through everything the Japanese had thrown at them, patching bullet holes with aluminum sheets, replacing damaged hydraulic lines in the cramped quarters of the carrier's hangar deck, and working 16-hour days to ensure Hartford always had a reliable aircraft. The two men had developed an unspoken bond, the kind that forms when your life depends on someone else's skill and dedication. Torres had been with Hartford since the beginning of his deployment. He remembered the first time they met, Hartford fresh from training, and Torres already a veteran of the carrier war. The crew chief had looked at the new pilot with barely concealed skepticism, another green officer who thought he knew everything. But Hartford had surprised him. Instead of lecturing or giving orders, Hartford had asked questions. He wanted to know about the Corsair's quirks, its strengths and weaknesses, what signs to watch for that might indicate developing problems. Torres had warmed to the young pilot quickly, recognizing in him a genuine desire to learn and survive. Over the months, they had developed a routine. After every flight, Hartford would walk Torres through what had happened, how the aircraft had performed, any anomalies he had noticed. Torres would listen, make notes, and address every issue, no matter how minor. The crew chief took personal pride in maintaining the best aircraft in the squadron, and Hartford's survival record proved his dedication. Hartford returned the gesture, then focused on his pre-flight checklist. Oil pressure gauge, 75 pounds per square inch, normal. Fuel mixture controls, set to auto-rich. Magnetos, both checked and functioning. Hydraulic pressure, adequate. Oxygen system tested and ready. The checklist was long and detailed, but Hartford never rushed it. He had seen too many pilots die from mechanical failures that might have been caught with a thorough pre-flight inspection. All systems reading normal. He gave Torres a final nod, and the crew chief stepped back, his expression serious but confident. That Corsair would not let Hartford down, not if Torres had anything to say about it. The carrier's loudspeakers crackled to life, and the air boss's voice cut through the morning air, calling Hartford's flight to stations. He was leading a patrol of 4 Corsairs, tasked with escorting a photo reconnaissance mission over Japanese-held territory near Bougainville. The other 3 pilots in his flight were experienced men, veterans of the Guadalcanal campaign who had learned their trade in the desperate early days of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Robert Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, would fly on his right wing. Chen was quiet, methodical, and had a reputation for keeping his cool under fire. On his left would be Ensign David Walsh from Boston, younger than the others but sharp and eager to prove himself. The fourth pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade Thomas Burke from Texas, would fly as Tail End Charlie, watching their backs. Hartford ran through the mission parameters one more time in his mind as the deck crew signaled him forward. The launch was smooth, the Corsair's powerful Pratt & Whitney engine roaring to life as Hartford released the brakes and accelerated down the deck. The moment of transition, when the aircraft left the carrier and hung in the air before gaining speed, always brought a flutter to his stomach. Then the Corsair was climbing, the wind rushing past the canopy, and Hartford was back in his element. The four aircraft formed up quickly, circling the carrier once before heading northwest toward their patrol area. Below them, the Solomon Islands stretched out in a patchwork of green jungle and blue water, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Hartford checked his fuel gauge, his ammunition counter, and scanned the sky around him. Clear. For now. They had been airborne for 40 minutes when Hartford's radio crackled. The reconnaissance plane, a Navy PBY Catalina flying boat, reported completing its photo run and turning for home. Hartford acknowledged and adjusted his course to rendezvous with the slow-moving seaplane. The Catalina was vulnerable, a lumbering target that needed fighter escort to survive in contested airspace. As they approached the meeting point, Hartford's eyes continuously swept the sky, looking for the telltale glint of sunlight on metal that would indicate enemy aircraft. The Pacific sun was bright, creating patches of glare that could hide an approaching enemy fighter. He squinted through his polarized goggles, searching. Chen's voice came through the radio, calm but urgent. Bandits, 11 o'clock high, multiple contacts. Hartford's head snapped around and he saw them, dark specks against the clouds growing larger. His stomach tightened. This wasn't a small patrol. He counted quickly. 10, 15, 20 aircraft, maybe more. They were too far away to identify, but Hartford knew in his gut what they were. Japanese Zeros, the nimble fighters that had dominated the early Pacific War. He keyed his radio and ordered his flight to climb, to gain altitude before the enemy could engage. The Corsair's engine roared as he pushed the throttle forward, the aircraft responding with a surge of power. The Japanese formation split, and Hartford realized with growing alarm that more aircraft were emerging from the clouds behind the first group. 30, 40. He stopped counting. The reconnaissance photos had been right. The Japanese were massing their air strength for something big. His flight of 4 Corsairs was suddenly facing odds that made his blood run cold. He radioed the carrier, reporting the contact and requesting immediate support. The response was not what he wanted to hear. The nearest friendly fighters were 20 minutes away. 20 minutes in a dogfight was an eternity. Walsh's voice came through, young and tight with tension. "Skipper, what are we going to do?" Hartford made the decision instantly. They had to buy time for the PBY to escape. If that reconnaissance data was lost, other American lives would be at risk. He ordered Chen to escort the Catalina back to the fleet at maximum speed while he, Walsh and Burke would engage the Japanese and draw them away. Chen protested, but Hartford cut him off. That was an order. Chen peeled away with visible reluctance, diving toward the lumbering PBY below. The Japanese fighters were closing fast now, and Hartford could make out their distinctive shapes. Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, painted in varying shades of green and grey, their red Hinomaru insignia clearly visible on wings and fuselage. They were diving to attack, using their altitude advantage. Hartford counted again, forcing himself to be precise. 58 enemy aircraft. The number was almost absurd. He had never faced odds like this, had never heard of anyone facing odds like this and surviving. Burke's voice came through the radio, steady despite the circumstances. "We're with you, Skipper. Whatever it takes." Walsh added his own affirmation, and Hartford felt a surge of pride in these men, his wingmen, who were choosing to stay and fight despite the overwhelming numbers. Hartford knew the Corsair's strengths. It was faster than the Zero, especially in a dive, and it could take more punishment. But the Zero was more maneuverable, could turn tighter, and in the hands of an experienced pilot was deadly. The Japanese pilots diving toward them now had been flying combat missions since the war's beginning. They knew their aircraft, knew their tactics, and they had the numbers. Hartford's mind raced through his options. Running wasn't viable, not with the slow PBY needing time to escape. Fighting conventionally would be suicide. He needed something else, something unexpected. The first Zeros opened fire, and Hartford saw the tracers arcing toward him, bright lines of deadly intent cutting through the Pacific sky. Each tracer represented 5 bullets, the deadly mathematics of air combat. He threw the Corsair into a hard banking turn, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat, his vision graying at the edges as blood drained from his head. Years of physical conditioning and experience helped him fight through the forces, keeping his vision focused even as his body protested the violent maneuver. The tracers passed behind him, so close he could almost feel their heat, and he rolled out, briefly gaining separation from the immediate threat. Walsh and Burke were weaving frantically, trying to avoid the streams of fire from multiple directions. Hartford could see them clearly, 2 Corsairs twisting and turning like dancers in a deadly ballet. Each pilot was fighting his own battle while trying to maintain some semblance of formation. Hartford keyed his radio and gave quick orders, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Stay close. Use vertical maneuvers, don't try to turn with them. The Corsair could outclimb and outdive the Zero. That was their only advantage, the singular tactical edge that might keep them alive. The Zero could turn inside them in a heartbeat, could loop tighter, could sustain turns that would stall a Corsair. But in vertical flight, in the climbs and dives that characterized modern fighter combat, the American aircraft's superior power and structural strength gave them a fighting chance. A Zero flashed past Hartford's canopy, close enough that he could see the pilot's leather helmet and goggles, could see the individual panels of the enemy aircraft's fuselage, could see the gun ports in the wings. The proximity was stunning, almost intimate in its closeness. He snap-rolled right and got on the Japanese fighter's tail, his reflexes taking over. The gun sight appeared in his vision, the illuminated reticle settling on the enemy aircraft. He squeezed the trigger, feeling the Corsair shudder with the recoil as his 650 caliber machine guns hammered out their message. Each gun fired at different rates due to variations in ammunition feed and mechanical timing, creating a distinctive sound that every Corsair pilot knew. The combined weight of fire was devastating. Hartford saw his tracers walk across the Zero's wing, tearing metal like paper, and the enemy fighter rolled away, trailing smoke, pieces of aluminum skin fluttering in its wake. No time to confirm the kill. 2 more Zeros were diving on him from above, their attack coordinated and professional. These weren't inexperienced pilots. They worked together, one forcing Hartford to commit to a defensive maneuver, while the other positioned for the kill shot. Hartford pushed the stick forward and dove, using the Corsair's superior speed to open the range. The massive Pratt & Whitney engine roared as he accelerated, the airframe vibrating with the forces of high-speed flight. The enemy fighters followed, but couldn't match his dive speed. The Corsair's rugged construction allowed Hartford to push the aircraft to speeds that would tear apart a lighter fighter. He pulled up hard at 3,000 feet, the Corsair groaning under the strain as G-forces multiplied his body weight. His vision tunneled, the world narrowing to a small circle directly ahead. But he held the pull, trusting his training and his aircraft. The Corsair responded, climbing back into the fight, the engines screaming defiance. The sky had become a churning mass of aircraft, Zeros everywhere Hartford looked. Burke called out that he was hit, his voice strained. Hartford spotted him, trailing fuel vapor, with 3 Zeros closing in. He pushed his throttle to the firewall and dove to help, firing a long burst that forced the Japanese fighters to break off. Burke's Corsair was badly damaged, the engine sputtering, fuel streaming from ruptured tanks. Hartford ordered him to head for the deck to try to make it back to the carrier. Burke acknowledged and dove away, nursing his dying aircraft. That left just Hartford and Walsh against nearly 60 enemy fighters. Walsh was holding his own, using the tactics Hartford had drilled into the squadron. Dive, fire, climb, repeat. Don't get into a turning fight. But the young pilot was running low on ammunition, and the Japanese were learning to anticipate their moves. Hartford saw a zero line up on Walsh's tail, the enemy pilot patient and skilled, waiting for the perfect shot. Hartford's heart raced. He was too far away to help directly. He keyed his radio and shouted for Walsh to break right now. Walsh responded instantly, throwing his Corsair into a violent barrel roll. The Zero's burst missed, and Walsh dove away. But another Japanese fighter was already positioning for a shot. Hartford made a decision that went against every tactical instinct he had. Instead of diving to help Walsh, he climbed. He climbed hard, straight up into the mass of circling Japanese fighters, making himself the most obvious target in the sky. The effect was immediate. Zeros peeled off from other pursuits and turned toward him, the lone Corsair climbing audaciously into their midst. Hartford counted on the Japanese sense of honor and the individual warrior spirit that drove their pilots. They would want this kill for themselves. He was betting his life that their competitive nature would work against their tactical coordination. The gambit worked. At least 20 Zeros converged on Hartford, each pilot maneuvering to get the killing shot. But in their eagerness, they got in each other's way. Hartford reached the top of his climb, the Corsair hanging in the air for a moment. Then he rolled inverted and dove. Zeros scattered, trying to track him, but Hartford was already accelerating downward at speeds the Japanese fighters couldn't match. He pulled out of the dive just above the wave tops, skimming the ocean surface at over 400 knots. Several Zeros tried to follow, but pulled out higher, wary of hitting the water. Hartford had gained a few precious seconds. He used those seconds to check his fuel and ammunition. Both were critically low. He had maybe 10 minutes of combat fuel left, and his gun ammunition counters showed less than 200 rounds per gun. Walsh called in, his voice urgent. He was out of ammunition entirely and running on fumes. Hartford ordered him to disengage and head for home. Walsh protested, but Hartford made it clear. There was nothing more the young pilot could do here except die uselessly. Walsh acknowledged reluctantly and turned east, diving for speed, several Zeros pursuing but unable to catch the fleeing Corsair. Now Hartford was alone. 50-plus Japanese fighters and one damaged, low-fuel, nearly out of ammunition F4U Corsair. The rational choice was to run, to dive for the deck and use his speed advantage to escape. But Hartford looked at his watch. Chen and the PBY needed more time. The reconnaissance data had to get through. He thought of Torres and the deck crew, waiting for him to return. He thought of his wife, Sarah, back in Virginia, her last letter tucked in his flight suit pocket. He thought of all the pilots who had died in this war, good men who had fought impossible odds because it was necessary. He keyed his radio one last time, broadcasting to the carrier, "This is Hartford, still engaging, will hold as long as possible." The Japanese fighters had regrouped and were coming at him in coordinated waves now. Hartford climbed again, but this time he didn't have the altitude advantage. Zeros came at him from every direction, their pilots firing in controlled bursts. He felt impacts along his wings, heard the sharp crack of bullets punching through metal. His instrument panel shattered as a round came through the cockpit, showering him with glass. Blood ran down his face from a cut above his eye, warm and sticky. He wiped it away and kept fighting. Hartford had lost track of how many Zeros he had engaged. Time had become fluid in combat, seconds stretching into eternities, while entire minutes vanished in the blink of an eye. His windscreen was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading from an impact point where a bullet had struck without penetrating. making it hard to see clearly through the distorted glass. His controls felt sluggish, damaged by enemy fire, the hydraulic lines probably leaking fluid. Every movement of the stick required more force than normal, his arms aching from wrestling the wounded aircraft through its maneuvers. The Corsair's engine was running rough. A cylinder hit, or maybe a fuel line damaged, the once smooth roar now interrupted by periodic misfires and rough spots that sent vibrations through the airframe. He was running on willpower and the robust engineering of the Chance Vought Aircraft Company. Every second he stayed in the air was borrowed time, purchased with Torres's meticulous maintenance and the Corsair's legendary toughness. The aircraft could absorb punishment that would bring down lesser fighters, its radial engine and redundant systems designed specifically to bring pilots home from impossible situations. Hartford sent a silent prayer of thanks to every engineer and mechanic who had contributed to this machine's design and upkeep. Every weld, every rivet, every carefully torqued bolt was now the difference between life and death. Hartford fired his last rounds at a Zero that crossed his nose, the guns chattering for a final brief moment. He led the target perfectly, years of training and dozens of combat missions guiding his aim instinctively. He saw the tracers connect, stitching across the Zero's fuselage and wing route, and the enemy fighter nosed over and fell toward the ocean, trailing fire and smoke. Then his guns were silent, the ammunition counters at 0, all 4,000 rounds expended. The sudden quiet was almost shocking after the constant hammering of the 50 caliber guns. Hartford's Corsair was now just a fast, maneuverable target with no way to fight back. The hunter had become the hunted in the most final way possible. The Japanese pilots must have realized he was out of ammunition because their attacks became bolder, more aggressive. They closed in, firing from angles that would have been too risky before. Hartford could only evade, using what little speed and altitude he had left. A sustained burst from a Zero behind him stitched across his fuselage, and he felt the Corsair shudder. His engine coughed, black smoke pouring from the cowling. The oil pressure gauge dropped to 0. He was hit badly, critically. The engine was dying. Hartford's hands moved automatically, shutting down the fuel pumps, pulling the mixture to idle cutoff, trying to prevent a fire. The propeller windmilled slowly, then stopped. The sudden silence was eerie after the constant roar of the engine and the chatter of machine guns. He was gliding now, a powerless aircraft surrounded by enemy fighters. The Zeros circled him like sharks, but strangely they held their fire. Hartford realized they were waiting to see if he would crash or bail out. There was a code among fighter pilots, even enemies, a respect for a brave opponent. He had fought them for nearly 20 minutes against impossible odds, and they were giving him a chance to save himself. But Hartford looked at his watch again. He had bought almost 25 minutes. The PBY should be safe now, well away from the battle area. Chen would have gotten the reconnaissance bird back to the fleet. The mission was accomplished. Hartford allowed himself a small smile, despite the pain and exhaustion. He had done his job. Now, he just had to survive. He keyed his radio, not knowing if it still worked. Hartford to any friendly aircraft. I am going in the water approximately 30 miles northwest of Bougainville. He gave his best estimate of coordinates, then prepared for the ditching. The ocean was coming up fast. Hartford lowered his flaps manually, using the emergency system, trying to bleed off speed. The Corsair responded sluggishly, damaged control surfaces barely responding. He aimed for a stretch of water that looked relatively smooth, though from this height it was hard to judge. The Japanese fighters had pulled away, giving him room. Some waggled their wings, a gesture of respect. Hartford focused on the water rushing up to meet him. He had practiced ditching procedures, but actually doing it in a combat-damaged aircraft was entirely different. The Corsair hit the water hard, harder than Hartford expected. The impact threw him forward against his harness, knocking the wind from his lungs. Water exploded over the canopy as the aircraft decelerated violently. The nose dipped, and for a terrifying moment Hartford thought the Corsair would cartwheel and sink immediately. But the aircraft settled, floating low in the water, the inverted gull wings keeping it afloat for the moment. Hartford struggled with the canopy, his hands shaking from adrenaline and shock. The canopy mechanism was jammed, bent by the ditching impact. Panic flared as water began seeping into the cockpit. Hartford braced his feet and pushed upward on the canopy with all his strength. Metal groaned, and then suddenly it gave way, sliding back. He scrambled out, his Mae West life jacket inflating automatically as he hit the water. The Corsair was sinking fast now, the nose going under first. Hartford swam away, putting distance between himself and the dying aircraft. He looked back once, seeing the tail section rise briefly above the water, then slide beneath the surface with a quiet gurgle. His aircraft was gone, taking with it his parachute and survival gear. All he had was his life jacket, his service pistol, and the contents of his pockets. The ocean was warmer than he expected, the tropical waters of the Solomon Islands holding the day's heat. But Hartford knew exposure would be a problem if he wasn't picked up quickly. The human body lost heat much faster in water than in air, and even warm water would eventually sap his strength and lead to hypothermia. He looked up and saw the Japanese fighters circling above, their engines creating a distant drone that echoed across the water. 1-0 came down low, flying past him slowly at what couldn't have been more than 50 feet above the waves. The engine noise was deafening at such close range, the distinctive sound of the Nakajima Sakai radial engine washing over him. The pilot was clearly visible through the canopy, a young man not much different in age from Hartford himself, wearing the standard leather flying helmet and goggles that all naval aviators wore regardless of nationality. The Japanese pilot's face was serious, concentrated, as he looked down at Hartford floating in the water. For a long moment, their eyes met across the gulf of war and nationality. Hartford saw in that pilot's expression something he recognized, something beyond enmity. Perhaps respect for a brave opponent, perhaps contemplation of his own mortality reflected in the downed American pilot, perhaps simply the acknowledgement of one warrior to another. The Japanese pilot gave a slow, formal nod, a gesture of respect that transcended the circumstances. Then he advanced his throttle and climbed away, the Zero's engine note changing as it gained altitude. Within minutes, all the Zeros had departed, heading back to their base at Rabaul, or wherever they had launched from. Hartford was alone in the vast Pacific Ocean, the silence after the departing aircraft almost oppressive. He floated on his back, conserving energy, and took stock of his situation with the methodical calm that had gotten him through the aerial combat. He was wounded, bleeding from the cut above his eye, where the instrument panel glass had cut him, and several shrapnel wounds he hadn't noticed during the fight, adrenaline having masked the pain. Now he could feel each one, a throbbing reminder of how close he had come to dying in the air. His left shoulder ached deeply, probably wrenched during the violent ditching, the muscles and tendons protesting every movement. He was perhaps 30 miles from the nearest land, which was Japanese-held Bougainville, so that wasn't an option. Swimming that far was impossible, even if he weren't wounded, and reaching Japanese territory would only exchange drowning for interrogation and a prison camp. His best hope was that his radio call had gotten through and that rescue would be sent. The Navy had become much better at rescuing downed pilots as the war progressed, dedicated submarines and seaplanes assigned to patrol likely areas. Whether they would find him in the vast ocean was another question entirely. He checked his waterproof watch, a gift from Sarah before his deployment. It was just past noon. He had been in combat for less than 30 minutes, though it had felt like hours, time dilating in the way it always did when survival hung in the balance. Every second of the fight was etched in his memory with crystal clarity, yet the overall experience had the quality of a fevered dream. The sun beat down, and Hartford felt the first touches of thirst. He had no water, no shade, no supplies. Survival training had taught him the basics, but out here, bobbing in the Pacific with nothing but a life jacket, those basics seemed woefully inadequate. He tried to remember the lessons. Stay calm, conserve energy, don't drink seawater no matter how thirsty you get. Watch for sharks, but don't panic if you see one, as panic attracts them. He laughed bitterly at that last piece of advice. Easy to say in a classroom, harder when you're bleeding in shark-infested waters. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, and Hartford drifted with the current. His wounds had stopped bleeding, but he felt weak from blood loss and the crash of adrenaline wearing off. He thought about Sarah, about the life they had planned before the war. They were going to buy a farm in Virginia, raise horses, have children. Simple dreams that seemed impossibly distant now. He thought about his parents, his father, a veteran of the First World War, who had understood when Hartford enlisted. He thought about Torres and the deck crew, about Chen, Walsh, and Burke. Had Burke made it back? Hartford hoped so. As the sun began to lower toward the horizon, Hartford heard an engine. His heart leaped. Aircraft. He looked up, searching the sky, and saw a single plane approaching. Relief flooded through him until he got a better look. It was a Japanese float plane, probably launched from a cruiser or seaplane tender. The aircraft circled him, low and slow, and Hartford could see the observer in the rear cockpit looking down at him. He waited, tense, wondering if they would strafe him or attempt a rescue. The Japanese were known to sometimes rescue downed enemy pilots, sometimes execute them. It seemed to depend on the individual circumstances and the men involved. The float plane circled twice more, then flew away without taking any action. Hartford didn't know if he was relieved or disappointed. The aircraft had confirmed his position, but to whom? Would the Japanese send a ship to pick him up as a prisoner, or had they simply noted his position and left him to die? There was no way to know. The sound of the engine faded, and Hartford was alone again with the ocean and the approaching night. Night in the Pacific was different from anything Hartford had experienced, even different from night flights over the carrier. The temperature dropped noticeably as the sun disappeared, and without its warmth, the tropical water that had seemed comfortable during the day began to leach heat from his body. Hartford began to shiver uncontrollably, despite the relatively warm water, his body's attempt to generate heat through muscle movement. The shivering came in waves, each one more violent than the last, and he knew this was the early stage of hypothermia setting in. The stars came out, brilliant and uncountable, painted across a sky clearer than any he had seen from land. The Milky Way appeared as a river of light across the heavens, individual stars, sharp and bright, without the interference of city lights or atmospheric haze. In different circumstances, it would have been beautiful, perhaps the most beautiful sky Hartford had ever seen. He had always loved astronomy, had spent hours as a child lying in the Virginia grass and picking out constellations with his father. Orion the Hunter, the Big Dipper, Cassiopeia's distinctive W shape. Here in the Pacific, the stars seemed close enough to touch, and southern constellations he had only read about were visible above the horizon. But beauty was a luxury Hartford couldn't afford right now. Survival demanded his full attention. Hartford fought to stay awake, knowing that sleep could mean death if he slipped out of his life jacket or if a wave washed over him while unconscious. The Mae West was designed to keep him afloat even if unconscious, but he didn't trust it completely, didn't trust anything except his own vigilance. He recited poetry, every poem he had memorized in school, every verse Sarah had shared with him in her letters. He went through song lyrics, from patriotic anthems to popular swing tunes. He sang them quietly, his voice hoarse from salt water and exhaustion. but the act of singing kept his mind engaged. He counted stars, picking a section of sky and methodically counting every visible point of light. When he finished one section, he moved to another. Anything to keep his mind active, to fight the creeping exhaustion that threatened to pull him under. He went through every mission he had flown, remembering each one in meticulous detail. His first combat patrol, the nervous excitement and the anticlimactic nature of finding nothing. His first confirmed kill, the mixture of triumph and horror at ending another human life. The mission where he had saved Walsh from a pursuing Zero, the bond of brotherhood that had formed in that moment. Each memory was vivid, sharp, important. These experiences had made him who he was, had taught him how to survive this exact situation. Sometime in the deep night, when Hartford was beginning to wonder if he had the strength to last until dawn, he thought he heard engines again. He strained to listen, but the sound faded, swallowed by the endless susurration of waves. Hallucination, probably, brought on by exhaustion and dehydration. His mind playing tricks, creating the rescue he desperately needed. Then he heard it again, definitely engines, multiple engines, and they were getting closer. This wasn't a hallucination, this was real. A ship, possibly several ships, somewhere in the darkness. But were they American or Japanese? Hartford had no way to know, but he decided it didn't matter. Even capture was better than dying alone in the ocean. He fumbled for the waterproof flashlight attached to his life jacket, a small pen light meant for signaling. He clicked it on and waved it, 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short. SOS in Morse code. Again and again he signaled, his arm aching with the effort. A searchlight blazed across the water, blinding him. Hartford shielded his eyes and kept signaling. The light found him, locked on, and he heard voices shouting. American voices. He nearly wept with relief. A ship was approaching, a destroyer by the sound of its engines. Within minutes, sailors were in the water beside him, helping him toward a cargo net hanging over the destroyer's side. Hartford's hands were so numb he could barely grip the net, but strong arms grabbed him and hauled him up. He collapsed on the deck, shivering and barely conscious. Someone was giving him water, small sips, and wrapping him in blankets. A pharmacist's mate was checking his wounds, asking questions Hartford could barely process. He heard someone say they had been searching for 6 hours, that his radio call had gotten through, that Chen had reported the position, and a PBY had spotted his life jacket just before dark. Hartford managed to ask about Burke. The young sailor tending to him smiled. Burke made it back, crash-landed on the carrier deck with no fuel and a dead engine, but he walked away. Hartford closed his eyes, overwhelming gratitude washing through him. The ship's doctor arrived and examined Hartford more thoroughly. Superficial wounds, nothing life-threatening, but significant dehydration and the early stages of hypothermia. They carried him below to sickbay, laid him on a clean bunk, and started an IV. The doctor told him he was lucky, incredibly lucky. Hartford mumbled something about luck having nothing to do with it, thinking of Torres's maintenance, Chen's escort of the PBY, Walsh and Burke's courage, the destroyer crew's persistence in searching. It was skill, dedication, and people looking out for each other. As Hartford drifted towards sleep, warm and safe for the first time in nearly 18 hours, he heard officers talking in low voices near the sick bay entrance. They were discussing the reconnaissance photos that the PBY had brought back. The intelligence was vital, showing a major Japanese naval buildup that had allowed the fleet to prepare for a significant enemy operation. Hartford's delaying action had saved the PBY, and the PBY's data had potentially saved hundreds of American lives. One officer said something about recommending Hartford for the Navy Cross. Hartford didn't care about medals. He was just glad to be alive, glad his wingman had survived, glad the mission had succeeded. The destroyer took Hartford back to the carrier task force, arriving late the following day. As he climbed awkwardly up the carrier's side, his shoulder strapped and his head bandaged, the deck erupted in cheers. The entire air group was there, pilots and crew alike. Torres pushed through the crowd and grabbed Hartford in a careful hug, mindful of his injuries. Chen, Walsh and Burke were there too, grinning. Burke's face was bruised from his crash landing, but he was whole. They all were. The squadron commander, a full commander named Richardson, pulled Hartford aside after the celebration died down. The photo reconnaissance had revealed the Japanese were planning a major air attack on the fleet. Thanks to the warning, fighters had been positioned and ships dispersed. When the attack came 2 days later, it was met by overwhelming American air power and resulted in a decisive victory with minimal U.S. losses. Richardson looked Hartford in the eye and said quietly that his actions had changed the course of that battle. Hartford didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded. In the weeks that followed, as Hartford recovered from his injuries in the carrier's sickbay and later at a rear area hospital in New Caledonia, the story of the fight spread through the Pacific Fleet like wildfire. The pilot who fought 58 Zeros and lived. The legend grew with each telling, details getting exaggerated as such stories inevitably do. Some versions had him shooting down 20 enemy aircraft single-handedly. Others claimed he had fought for over an hour. The essential truth remained beneath the embellishments, though. Hartford had faced impossible odds and through skill, courage and determination had accomplished his mission and survived. The Navy Cross was indeed awarded in a ceremony aboard the carrier after Hartford returned to duty. The squadron gathered on the hangar deck, dress whites crisp in the tropical heat, as the Admiral read the citation. For extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty while serving as a pilot in Fighter Squadron 9. Lieutenant Commander Hartford, with complete disregard for his own safety, engaged a vastly superior enemy force to protect a vital reconnaissance mission. Despite being outnumbered nearly 60-1, he maintained contact with the enemy for over 20 minutes, inflicting significant losses and preventing them from intercepting friendly aircraft. His exceptional airmanship and tactical acumen exemplify the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. Along with the medal came a promotion to commander and assignment as the executive officer of a fighter squadron being formed for operations in the Philippine campaign. It was an important position, one that recognized not just his combat prowess, but his leadership abilities. Hartford accepted the promotion with mixed feelings. Part of him wanted to stay with his current squadron, with Torres and Chen and Walsh and Burke, the men who had become his family. But another part recognized that he could do more good training new pilots, passing on the hard-won lessons he had learned. The war was far from over, and the Navy needed experienced combat leaders. But Hartford never forgot that day over the Solomon Islands. He never forgot the weight of the decision to stay and fight, the faces of his wingmen, the sight of those Zeros filling the sky, the eerie silence as his engine died, the cold Pacific water. He carried those memories for the rest of his life, through the remainder of the war and the peaceful decades that followed. Hartford did buy that farm in Virginia after the war, did raise horses with Sarah, did have 3 children who grew up hearing stories about their father's service. But he rarely talked about that specific mission, the one that made him famous in naval aviation circles. When pressed, he would only say that he did what was necessary, that his wingmen deserved equal credit, that Torres and the deck crew made the real difference by keeping the aircraft flying. In his study at the farm, Hartford kept a painting of an F4U Corsair, its distinctive inverted gull wings catching the light. Visitors who knew his history would look at the painting and ask about that day, about facing 58 Zeros alone. Hartford would smile, that same slight smile he had managed while gliding his dying aircraft toward the ocean, and he would say that he was never really alone. He had his training, his aircraft, his wingmen, the crew, the sailors who searched through the night. All those people, all that support, that was what got him through. Years later, Long after the war, Hartford was contacted by a historian researching that particular battle. The historian had found Japanese records and wanted to interview Hartford. The researcher explained that the Japanese pilots who fought that day had their own stories. They spoke of an American pilot who fought with such ferocity and skill against impossible odds that several of them had refused to fire the killing shot when his aircraft was crippled, viewing it as dishonorable to shoot down a defenseless but brave enemy. Hartford listened to this and felt an unexpected connection across the years and the old enmity. Those Japanese pilots were men like him, doing their duty as they saw it, capable of both violence and honor. The historian asked Hartford if there was anything he wanted to say about that day, any final thoughts for the record. Hartford was quiet for a long time, looking out the window of his farmhouse at the Virginia hills. Finally, he spoke. He said that war reveals what people are capable of, both terrible and extraordinary. He said that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. He said that survival in combat is never just about one person. It's about training, teamwork, maintenance crews, rescue operations, and sometimes a little bit of fortune. Most importantly, he said that every pilot who went up in those battles, American or Japanese, was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father, and that remembering their humanity was important even when circumstances forced them to kill each other. When Hartford died in 1998 at the age of 82, his funeral was attended by surviving members of his old squadron, including Chen, Walsh, and Burke. Torres, who had remained Hartford's lifelong friend, gave the eulogy. He spoke about a young pilot who trusted his crew chief completely, who led with courage and compassion, who faced 58 enemy fighters and lived to tell about it not through luck, but through skill, determination, and the support of everyone around him. The story, Torres said, wasn't really about one man against impossible odds. It was about what people can accomplish when they work together, trust each other, and refuse to give up no matter how desperate the situation appears. The F4U Corsair that Hartford flew that day rests at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, somewhere northwest of Bougainville. But its story lives on in naval aviation history, in the memories of those who knew Hartford, and in the lesson that courage and determination can sometimes overcome even the most impossible odds. Not through magic or miracles, but through human resilience, training, support, and the refusal to surrender when others depend on you. Hartford's medal citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty, but the real measure of the man was visible in smaller ways, in how he always credited others, in how he treated former enemies with respect, in how he lived his life after the war with the same quiet courage he showed in combat. The 58 zeros were just one day in a life full of meaning, just one example of doing what needed to be done regardless of the cost. That, perhaps, is the real story worth telling and remembering.